Jack Adams was a man who had everything, or so it seemed. A billionaire with a sprawling empire that touched every corner of the world, his name emblazoned on towering skyscrapers, his face familiar to anyone who followed the pulse of global business. To the outside world, Jack was the embodiment of success, wealth, power, and influence, wrapped in an impeccably tailored suit. But beneath that polished veneer, a deep fracture had been growing for decades, a silent wound that no amount of money could heal. For Jack, the real cost of ambition was not measured in dollars or lost deals, but in the absence of something far more precious, his daughter, Kate. The story began 20 years earlier, in the quiet unraveling of a marriage. Sarah, his college sweetheart and the woman who had once dreamed of a simple, happy family, found herself suffocating under Jack's relentless drive to conquer the world. The demands of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals left little room for the delicate bonds of home life. When Sarah finally demanded a divorce, Jack chose the path of least resistance. He signed the papers, sent child support, and let her take Kate away, convincing himself it was what was best for everyone. But the truth, buried deep beneath his justifications, was far more painful. Jack had made a choice, ambition over family. And in doing so, he had unwittingly abandoned the daughter he would come to realize was the one thing money could never buy. Years passed. Kate became a ghost in his life. No calls, no visits, no birthday wishes. Jack's empire expanded, but his heart grew heavier with a silent, gnawing guilt he refused to confront. He drowned himself in work, pretending that success could fill the void his absence had created. Yet one night, that fragile illusion shattered. A call from Ellen, his ex-wife's sister, brought devastating news. Sarah had died in a car accident, and Kate, now a grown woman of 25, was lost and struggling in a small, forgotten town. Ellen's voice was sharp and accusing, a mirror reflecting Jack's failures. "You left her, Jack. You built your empire on her broken heart. Now deal with the consequences." For the first time in decades, Jack felt powerless, his towering achievements crumbling beneath the weight of his guilt. He hired a private investigator to find Kate, bracing himself for whatever truth awaited. When the call came, Jack learned she was working as a waitress in a rundown diner in Willow Creek, a place so far removed from his world of luxury it might as well have been another planet. The image of his daughter, tired and worn, caught in a life he never imagined, cut through Jack's pride and defenses. He was forced to confront the consequences of a lifetime spent chasing wealth at the cost of family. Stepping into that dimly lit diner, surrounded by the scent of burnt coffee and the hum of everyday struggles, Jack faced the hardest challenge of all, facing Kate herself. The daughter he had never truly known was no stranger to pain, betrayal, and sacrifice. Her cold, guarded reaction was a harsh reminder that time and neglect had forged a barrier thicker than any money could dismantle. Yet, beneath Kate's hardened exterior flickered the same fierce spirit, the same green eyes that had once held hope. What followed was not a story of instant reconciliation or easy forgiveness, but a slow, painstaking journey through anger, regret, and tentative steps toward healing. Jack's presence in Kate's life was awkward and unfamiliar. He was no longer the distant figure with endless resources, but a man trying, clumsily and humbly, to be the father he had failed to be. Kate's life was a far cry from the opulence Jack commanded. She was a single mother, struggling to keep her son safe and their lives intact against a backdrop of hardship and abandonment. Jack's billionaire world, filled with jets and penthouses, felt hollow in comparison to the raw reality Kate faced daily. He began to understand that love, presence, and trust were things money could never buy. Each small gesture, a cup of coffee, a repaired lock, a quiet moment watching Liam play, was a fragile brick in the bridge Jack desperately wanted to build. But the story was also shadowed by the ghosts of the past and the harsh realities of the present. The threat of losing the diner, the one place that anchored Kate's community and identity, loomed like a storm. Jack found himself fighting battles not just for his daughter and grandson but for the soul of a small town he barely knew. Alongside this struggle, Jack faced his own personal reckoning, choosing to step away from the empire he had built to embrace a new legacy, one defined not by wealth, but by family, forgiveness, and second chances. This was more than a tale of lost and found. It was a psychological journey into the depths of regret, the complexity of human relationships, and the possibility of redemption. Jack Adams, the billionaire, was finally learning what it meant to be a father, not through money or power, but through presence, humility, and the slow, imperfect work of rebuilding a life broken by absence. The past is a place both vivid and distant, a shadow that stretches long and never quite fades. For Jack, the memory of those early years was a tangled web of hope, love, and devastating loss. Before the skyscrapers, the boardrooms, and the endless battles for power, there was Sarah, the woman who believed in a future with him, the mother of their daughter, Kate. Their love had been fierce and unguarded, the kind that consumes you whole when you're young and reckless. But life, with its relentless pressures and cruel demands, began to unravel what they once held sacred. Jack's ambition was a wildfire, growing too fast and consuming everything in its path. What started as dreams of building a better life quickly turned into an obsession with success, a hunger that left no room for tenderness or patience. Sarah watched helplessly as the man she loved became a stranger, lost in endless meetings, flights, and phone calls that stretched late into the night. She begged him to slow down, to come home, to be present, not just in body, but in spirit. But Jack, blinded by the pursuit of greatness, dismissed her pleas as weakness, convinced that the sacrifices were temporary and necessary. The silence that grew between them was deafening. Arguments erupted over forgotten anniversaries, missed recitals, and broken promises. Kate, just a child, became a silent witness to a marriage crumbling beneath the weight of unspoken resentments and unmet expectations. Jack's pride, once a source of strength, hardened into a barrier that pushed Sarah further away. When she finally decided to leave, taking Kate with her, Jack's response was cold, distant, a legal settlement and a few letters, carefully penned and seldom sent. In those moments of separation, Jack told himself it was for the best, that by stepping back, he was giving Sarah and Kate the freedom to live a life untouched by the chaos he had created. But in truth, the emptiness that followed was a slow, relentless ache. The silence on the other end of the phone was a void that no deal or accomplishment could fill. Every missed birthday, every holiday spent alone in his penthouse, deepened the guilt he refused to face. He buried it beneath layers of business deals and public appearances, a mask that fooled everyone but himself. Time, instead of healing, seemed to deepen the wounds. Jack convinced himself that his absence was a price worth paying for the legacy he was building, a legacy that, ironically, now felt meaningless. The man who once craved power found himself powerless against the growing distance between him and his daughter. The real loss wasn't just the physical separation, but the gradual fading of a relationship that might never be restored. The news of Sarah's death shattered the fragile balance Jack had maintained. It was a brutal reminder that the past was not something he could escape or rewrite. Kate's sudden reappearance in his life was like a mirror held up to all the mistakes he had made, the years lost, the silence endured, the love neglected. The little girl who once needed him desperately had grown into a woman shaped by hardship, abandonment, and resilience. Jack realized that his greatest failure wasn't losing his fortune or reputation, but losing Kate. The weight of that loss pressed down on him with a force he had never known. It forced him to confront the man he had been and question the man he wanted to become. The past, with all its pain and regret, was no longer something to run from but a painful path he had to walk if he hoped to find any kind of redemption. The search did not begin with a dramatic revelation or a sudden spark of hope. It began with an emptiness Jack could no longer ignore, a silence that echoed louder with each passing day. After Sarah's death, he expected some kind of closure, a finality that would allow him to return to the rhythm of his well-constructed world. But grief is rarely so orderly. It comes in fragments, quiet and persistent, unraveling the illusions you've built to protect yourself. In Jack's case, it began with a single photograph, creased, faded, tucked inside the last envelope Sarah had left for him. A photo of Kate at perhaps 16, her eyes sharp and unsure, standing beside a small-town storefront with a dog at her feet. There was no note, no address. Just the past, staring back at him. He tried to resist the impulse at first, told himself that she didn't need him, that reaching out now would only reopen wounds. But the days stretched long and vacant. The empire he had once ruled now felt like a monument to something hollow. He began making calls, quiet ones, through people who owed him favors or feared his name. It wasn't difficult to find the town. What was difficult was admitting to himself that he was afraid of what he would find, or worse, what he wouldn't. Had she vanished completely? Had she erased him from her life? The town was small, too quiet, the kind of place where everyone noticed a stranger. Jack, in his tailored coat and polished shoes, stood out like a misplaced ghost. He wandered its streets with a photograph in his pocket and a growing sense of shame in his chest. It was at the local diner, over burnt coffee and under dim fluorescent lights, that he first heard her name, Kate Delaney. The waitress hesitated before saying it, as if weighing whether to protect or expose her. But Jack was not a man easy to dismiss, and eventually the truth was gently, cautiously laid out. Kate was here. She had been for years, and no, she didn't speak much about her past. He found her working at a small veterinary clinic on the edge of town. Through the glass window, he watched her lift a wounded dog from a table, her hands steady and tender, her face older but heartbreakingly familiar. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had taught herself not to need anyone. He hesitated before entering, his fingers trembling against the door handle. When she looked up and their eyes met, something inside him collapsed. There was no smile, no rush of emotion, only a stillness that held 1,000 unspoken things. "Kate," he said, his voice low, strained from rehearsing it 100 times. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes lingered on him, searching, perhaps trying to decide whether this was real or just a memory come to torment her. "You're late," she finally said. Her tone was flat, but beneath it Jack heard the years, the pain, the questions she had learned to live with unanswered. He tried to speak, to explain, but how do you compress decades of failure, regret, and longing into a few sentences? Every word he wanted to say felt inadequate. Instead, he simply stood there, stripped of everything, wealth, control, pride, until all that remained was a father, broken and raw, hoping for a second chance. They sat together later in silence. Not the silence of strangers, but the heavy, fragile quiet of two people standing at the edge of a chasm. She didn't cry, didn't raise her voice. She just looked at him and asked, "Why now?" Jack didn't have a simple answer. He spoke of Sarah, of the mistakes, the distance, the cowardice that had kept him away. He told her he didn't expect forgiveness, only the chance to know her. Not the little girl he remembered, but the woman she had become. She listened, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. And when he was done, she stood up without a word and walked away. It wasn't rejection, not completely. It was something more complex, a test perhaps, or simply a boundary she needed to draw. Jack understood that if there was to be any hope of rebuilding, it would have to be on her terms. He left the clinic that day with no promises, no dramatic reconciliation. But he left with something he hadn't felt in years, the faint, painful flicker of possibility. A door had opened just slightly. And for Jack, that was enough to begin again. Kate's world was quiet now, in a way that once might have terrified her, but had slowly become her sanctuary. After the fire of youth, the betrayal of love, and the slow unraveling of everything she once believed permanent, she had learned to find beauty in small things. The smell of paper in the mornings when she opened the bookstore, the way the light filtered through the high windows around noon, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floor. The subtle ritual of making tea in the back room, alone, where no one expected her to talk or smile or pretend. She lived in a small one-bedroom apartment above the store. It wasn't much: slanted ceilings, creaking floors, a heater that complained every winter. But it was hers. Every piece of furniture had been chosen with care. Every book on her shelves bore a story she had lived through. The kettle was old and dented. The armchair by the window sagged slightly on the left side, but there was comfort in their familiarity. They didn't ask questions. They didn't leave. Kate had learned to move through her days without leaving ripples. She didn't crave attention. Her routines were precise, almost surgical. Morning walk through the park. Open the shop at 9. Handle inventory. Greet the regulars with practiced warmth. Recommend books without revealing too much of herself. In the evenings she read. Not to escape, not anymore, but to stay grounded. Stories had once been her way out of pain. Now they were her way into understanding it. Sometimes, when she was alone, she would still hear her mother's voice, soft and uncertain, from those last days before the silence. "He'll come back one day, you know. Not for me. For you." Kate had never replied to that. She had wanted to scream, "I don't want him back. He left." But the truth was murkier than anger could ever express. She hadn't hated Jack. She hadn't even fully resented him. It was more like a wound that never learned how to close properly. A dull, persistent ache that showed up in unexpected moments, like when a child in the store called their father with unfiltered joy, or when someone asked if her parents still lived in the city, not knowing what the question cost her. In the town of Asheville, Kate was known as dependable, thoughtful, quiet. No one knew she'd once lived in penthouses. No one asked about the scar behind her left shoulder, the one from when she'd fallen off the kitchen stool trying to bake a birthday cake alone at 8 years old. No one knew that sometimes she woke up gasping from dreams where her mother cried behind locked doors, or her father walked away again and again, faceless in the fog. Yet she wasn't bitter. That was the strange part. She was broken, yes, but not angry. The sharp edges had dulled over time, not from forgiveness, but from fatigue. She had simply stopped expecting the past to change. When Jack reappeared, everything in her carefully structured world shifted just a fraction of an inch. Not violently, just enough to disturb the dust. Just enough to make the air feel heavier. She didn't tell anyone about the visit. She folded it up and placed it in the same drawer as all the other unresolved things in her life. She hadn't answered his messages since that day. She hadn't thrown them away either. There were nights she stared at her phone for too long, rereading his last words, "I'll be here if you ever want to talk." No pressure. Just, "I'm here." And somehow, that frightened her more than if he'd demanded forgiveness. She didn't know what she wanted from him, if anything. She wasn't sure if she wanted to open old wounds or close them permanently. But she knew that something had changed. Just a sliver. Just enough. She was no longer certain of the peace she'd built. Not because it wasn't real, but because now it felt temporary. The town clock chimed 7. The streets below her window were dimming into quiet. Kate closed her book and leaned back in the old chair, listening to the soft hum of the world moving on without her. And yet, somewhere deep inside her, a place she rarely visited, a thought stirred. What if the story wasn't over? What if it never was? Jack didn't rush it. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. Something in Kate's eyes the day they saw each other again told him that this wasn't going to be a matter of apologies and closure. This was going to be slow, painful, and uncertain, like trying to mend a porcelain figure that had shattered long ago and been swept into a quiet corner, forgotten, until the dust itself had become part of it. He started by walking past the bookstore more often. Sometimes he would come in, buy something he didn't need, and ask a question he already knew the answer to. Kate never told him to leave, but she never encouraged him either. Her civility was a mask so tightly woven he feared even a wrong breath might cause it to tear. And behind it, God. Behind it was a storm he'd created years ago and never stayed long enough to witness. But he kept coming. He didn't push. He learned the rhythms of her world without inserting himself into them. He learned when she took her lunch break, when she liked her coffee black with a single sugar, when she paused by the window at dusk with a faraway look that spoke of memories best left untouched. Weeks passed like this. Then one evening, she surprised him. She asked if he wanted to walk her home. No explanation, no emotion in her voice, just the offer. Raw and stripped down, like a threadbare bridge she wasn't sure he'd dare cross. He said yes, and they walked in silence. The streets were painted gold with lamplight. Their footsteps echoed too loudly for the words neither of them could yet say. Over time, words began to return, not as declarations but as fragments, quiet, unfinished, testing. They talked about books first, then weather, then a memory of a summer they'd once shared in Maine, when they were still young and drunk on the illusion of permanence. The memory made her laugh, not a full laugh, but a breath that hinted at it, and something in Jack's chest ached from the sound, like hearing music he'd once loved but forgotten. Eventually, he told her about the years in between. He didn't romanticize them. He didn't make excuses. He told her about the women who came and went, none of whom knew the version of him she had seen. He talked about the night his father died and he didn't cry, and the morning he woke up at 40 and felt nothing but dread. He talked about the therapy sessions he'd resisted, then crumbled through. He told her about the guilt, not just for leaving, but for never looking back. Kate listened. She didn't absolve. She didn't flinch. Her silence wasn't forgiveness. It was weight, carried with grace. She wasn't the girl he had left behind. She was someone else now, stronger in the quietest of ways. And then, on a Tuesday morning heavy with fog, she invited him to sit with her in the back room of the shop. 2 cups of tea. No words. Just sitting. Breathing. Being. The kind of silence that didn't hurt anymore. They never said, "Let's try again." There was no dramatic reconciliation, no sweeping declarations. What happened instead was a slow rebuilding, one breath at a time. A shared meal here, a book recommendation there, a conversation that lasted minutes longer than the last. They were not 2 people falling in love again. They were 2 people cautiously unearthing what had once been buried beneath bitterness and absence, brushing away the dirt to see if any of it could still breathe. One day, Jack found a note slipped inside a book he'd bought from the store. In Kate's neat, small handwriting, it read, "Some ruins are worth restoring, not to what they were, but to what they might still become." He didn't cry when he read it, but something inside him softened, the way dry earth does after the first autumn rain. They were still fragile, still full of unanswered questions, still wary of what came next. But for the first time in years, Jack felt something close to peace, not because the past had been erased, but because it had finally been acknowledged. And Kate? She had not forgiven everything. She had not forgotten. But she had found a strange strength in watching someone try, not with grand gestures, but with patience, honesty, and a quiet willingness to stand beside her, even when the air was thick with ghosts. Together, they were not rewriting their story. They were beginning a new one, written in lowercase letters and long pauses. One that began, simply, with 2 people choosing to stay, despite the cracks because of the cracks, and perhaps even through them. It began with something small. A missed appointment. Jack was supposed to help Kate with the shop's monthly inventory, a routine they had quietly built into their shared days, but he didn't show up. No message. No call. She waited for 20 minutes before going ahead alone, her movements stiff and mechanical, her breath caught in the familiar space between disappointment and dread. That space, she had lived there before. He arrived an hour later, flustered, apologetic, claiming he'd lost track of time during a client call. She nodded, said it was fine. But something in her chest pulled back, recoiled like a thread snapping under pressure. That night, she didn't text him good night like she usually did. He noticed. He didn't push. But it didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, moments began to surface like bubbles rising from somewhere deep and long buried. Jack had been offered a contract, out of state. A major firm. 6 months. High pay. High stakes. He hadn't told her. Not because he was leaving, but because he wasn't sure yet. And he knew what it might mean. He feared how she might read into it, how it might look like another betrayal, another departure masked as ambition. She found out anyway. Not from him, from a customer, a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it casually. That hurt more than the offer itself. When she confronted Jack, she didn't shout. Her voice was low and even, but her eyes shimmered with the cold fury of someone remembering how trust can crumble in seconds. "If you couldn't tell me this, what else will you hide when it matters?" she asked. He had no answer that didn't sound like an excuse. The weeks that followed were harder than either of them expected. Old wounds, once quiet, now screamed beneath every conversation. Jack's past, his leaving, his selfishness, his cowardice, rose like ghosts that had never truly left. Kate's defenses, so carefully dismantled, rebuilt themselves brick by brick. She withdrew. He overcompensated. Every act of kindness from him felt tainted with guilt. Every silence from her echoed with the unspoken question, "Will you do it again?" They tried. God, they tried. There were still moments, quiet dinners, shared walks, a joke that landed just right, when it almost felt normal. But normal was fragile. One morning, Kate saw him looking at plane tickets on his phone. He told her he wasn't booking them, just wondering. She didn't speak for the rest of the day. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, he wasn't there. He left a note. Not a goodbye, not a surrender, just a space. "I don't want to hurt you again. I need to think. I'll be back if you still want me." It was signed simply, J. Kate sat in the back room of the shop, staring at the note. She felt neither surprise nor rage, only fatigue. A deep, marrow-level exhaustion that came from loving someone who didn't quite know how to stay. She wanted to scream, to throw the note into the fire, to call him and demand why he always ran when things became real. But she did none of those things. Instead, she made herself tea. She sat in the old armchair by the window, and she cried, not for him, not entirely, for herself, for the version of her that still waited for men who left, for the girl who once thought love was supposed to save people. But as the days passed, something else happened too. She didn't collapse. The shop opened each morning. The kettle boiled. The world kept spinning. She was bruised, but not broken. And that surprised her. She remembered what her therapist had once told her, years ago when her mother died. Stability isn't the absence of pain. It's the presence of self, even when pain is loud. Kate was still here, still whole, still capable of breathing on her own. Jack's absence echoed, but it didn't destroy. And somewhere, in a place even she didn't yet understand, that realization felt like power. The letter came folded in 3, sealed with the kind of generic ink-stamped logo that always carried bad news. Kate didn't open it right away. It sat on the counter beside the till, next to the jar of peppermint candies and the battered guest book that still held Jack's messy handwriting from 3 weeks before he left. She let it stay there unopened for nearly an hour as she wiped down tables, refilled napkin holders, and smiled blankly at customers who asked if Marty would ever come back. It wasn't until after closing, when the cafe was silent except for the low hum of the fridge and the rain tapping against the window panes, that she tore the envelope open and read it. The words were clinical, soulless. The building was being foreclosed. Marty hadn't kept up with payments. No one in the family was claiming ownership. In 6 weeks, the property would be auctioned off. She stared at the bottom of the page, at the deadline, and something ancient stirred inside her. Not panic, not even grief. Something closer to defiance. Marty's had always been more than a diner. It was where she got her first job at 16, scrubbing dishes in the back. Where she met Jack. Where she sat with her mother after radiation treatments, her mother's frail hands wrapped around chipped coffee cups. It was where she returned to after the divorce, when she had nowhere else to go and no one who wanted her back. This place had been witness to every fracture in her life, and somehow, also the glue that kept those cracks from widening. She didn't sleep that night. She drafted emails to local officials, then deleted them. Made lists of potential investors, grants, community funds, anything that might help. The next morning, she brought in her laptop, brewed a pot of strong coffee, and started making calls between serving tables. The response was tepid at best. Too risky. The market's shifting. People don't go to diners anymore, Kate. She smiled politely and thanked them, then hung up and stared at the walls until her pulse settled. Days blurred. She learned more about property law in 3 weeks than she had in the past decade. She held fundraisers, small ones, music nights, pie auctions. Customers came. Some donated. A retired teacher left a $100 tip with a note. This place gave me comfort when I lost my wife. Don't let it go. A teenage girl, barely old enough to drive, brought in a painting she'd made of the diner and said, "My dad used to take me here before he got clean. It matters." Still, it wasn't enough. Kate thought about selling her car. She thought about calling Jack. The second idea felt worse. It wasn't that she didn't miss him, she did. But she didn't want saving. Not now. Not again. She wanted to know that she could stand in the fire and not be consumed by it. It was Sam who changed everything. Sam was Marty's nephew, a ghost from the past, lanky and unshaven, who drifted back into town after hearing the news. He wasn't interested in the business, but he wasn't indifferent either. They talked late one night in the diner, just the two of them, over whiskey and stale fries. Sam had no interest in running the place, but he had money. Inherited. Tied up in accounts he never touched. He made her an offer, not a gift, not a savior's handout, but a loan with strings, written down in plain ink. If you really want it, it's yours. I'll help. But you take the risk. You make it work. Kate stared at him, then at the papers, then at the walls around her. The walls she had scrubbed, painted, wept against. She signed. The process was ugly. Bureaucracy always is. But slowly, the diner stopped being a relic on borrowed time and started breathing again. The paint got touched up. The menu modernized. Students started hanging out in the evenings. A local newspaper ran a feature. An old man who hadn't stepped foot inside in 10 years returned, crying softly when he saw his late wife's picture still taped behind the register. Kate never said out loud what it meant to her. She didn't have to. It was in the way she came in early every morning, humming to herself. In the careful way she folded each receipt. In how she memorized the names of every new customer, even the shy ones. Jack returned once, months later. He stood outside the diner for a full minute before walking in. He looked thinner, older, but his eyes were still his. He said he was proud of her, said he thought about her every day. She listened, then handed him a coffee, just like old times, and they sat in silence as the world spun on outside. No promises. No grand gestures. Just a moment of shared warmth between two people who had both learned how to survive their own endings. Marty's didn't just survive. It became hers. And in the end, maybe that was the real rescue, not of a building, but of the part of herself she thought was lost forever. The girl who never asked for help, who bore everything in silence, was finally allowed to become the woman who chose her battles and claimed her space in the world. No one saw it happen. Not in one single moment. But it did. Quietly. Steadily. Like sunrise. Spring arrived quietly that year, slipping in on the heels of late frost and morning fog, as though nature itself wasn't yet ready to believe in warmth. Kate noticed it first in the way the light fell through the windows at Marty's, softer, fuller, lingering a little longer on the tile floor before retreating into evening. She also noticed it in herself. The tightness that had curled into her chest for years, the quiet dread she carried like a stone in her pocket, was beginning to loosen. Not vanish, just loosen. And that was something. She had never expected healing to feel so ordinary. She'd imagined some grand revelation, a lightning bolt of clarity, or perhaps some long-delayed confrontation with Jack that would open the wound wide enough for air to reach it. But there had been no thunderclap, no sweeping closure. Just slow mornings, long walks, unremarkable days stacked one on top of another until they formed a kind of peace. Jack visited again. Not often, just enough to let her know he was still orbiting her life, even if from a distance. Each time he came, they spoke less about the past. The need to rehash, to explain, to ask for something unspoken, it had faded. He didn't push for anything. Neither did she. There was a strange kind of grace in that restraint, in knowing that they had both finally stopped bleeding over things they could no longer fix. Kate still kept the box. It lived under her bed, taped at the corners, filled with old letters, faded photographs, and a lock of her mother's hair tied with blue thread. For years, she'd avoided it. Then, one night in late May, after the last customer left and the street outside was washed clean by rain, she opened it. Not because she needed to grieve again, but because she was no longer afraid of what was inside. There were pictures of Jack, young, grinning, arms wrapped around her waist. Letters she'd never sent, full of rage and love in equal measure. A list she'd written in the early days after their divorce, titled, "What I Lost." She read it slowly. Home, trust, a future, herself. Then she took a pen and wrote, underneath the last line, "What I've found." The words came easier than she expected. Purpose, community, strength, myself. She didn't cry. Not this time. The next morning, she stood outside the diner for a moment before unlocking the door. A new sign had been painted, hand-lettered, subtle. Marty's Reclaimed. Below that, in smaller font, owned and loved by Kate Weller. People asked her sometimes if she'd ever remarry, if she and Jack might find their way back to each other. She never gave a straight answer. Not because she was guarding a secret, but because some things were no longer questions to be answered. They simply were. Jack would always be part of her story, just not the ending. She began spending more time on the back porch of the small house she'd bought near the woods. She started growing herbs, mint, rosemary, lavender. She read books without skipping pages. She let herself laugh loudly at things that weren't funny to anyone else. She even bought a paint set one day and filled a canvas with nothing but blue, just because she could. And then, one quiet Sunday, as the diner buzzed with customers and the air smelled of cinnamon and coffee, a little girl tugged at her apron and said, "Miss Kate, are you the boss here?" Kate knelt down, looked her in the eyes, and smiled. "Yes, I guess I am." It wasn't triumph. It wasn't redemption. It was something softer, something more durable. A life built, not salvaged. A self-reclaimed, not reinvented. She would never be the woman she was before the losses. But she didn't want to be. That version of her had never known how strong she could become. In the end, the past remained where it belonged, not erased, but no longer in charge. It lived in the scent of old paper, in the echo of Jack's laugh, in the way her heart still tightened when she heard certain songs. But it didn't own her. It didn't define her. She was no longer running from anything, and that, more than anything else, meant she could finally begin. The dawn of Kate's new life was not marked by grand gestures or sudden transformations, but by the steady, almost imperceptible rhythm of growth, the kind that begins deep within and slowly radiates outward, coloring everything it touches with a renewed sense of purpose and calm. The diner, once a battleground of ghosts and regrets, now hummed quietly with the soft sounds of community and familiarity. Every chipped plate, every cracked tile, every worn booth told a story of survival, endurance, and, most importantly, change. Kate learned to listen differently, to see beyond the surface of things, the fleeting frustrations of the day, the tired eyes of a waitress struggling to hold on, the laughter of children who found comfort in the small corner where they could escape the outside world. Her mornings began earlier, no longer haunted by restless nights filled with memories that refused to fade but filled instead with deliberate rituals of self-care. A cup of herbal tea brewed with leaves from her small porch garden, a moment spent breathing in the quiet before the world demanded her attention. She discovered that growth was not linear. It was messy, tangled with setbacks and moments of doubt. But with each stumble, she gathered fragments of herself, pieces she thought were lost, and wove them into a tapestry more resilient than before. Kate's interactions deepened as well. Where she once guarded her heart with rigid walls, she now allowed herself vulnerability, small cracks through which light filtered in. She listened to the stories of her patrons, not just as background noise, but as threads connecting her to a broader human experience of pain, hope, and renewal. The diner became more than a business. It was a sanctuary, a shared space where lives intersected and healed. Her friendship with Marty, once strained by the looming threat of closure, blossomed into a partnership rooted in mutual respect and quiet affection, a testament to second chances. She began to dream again, not in the reckless, desperate way of her youth, but with tempered hope. Painting became more than a pastime. It was a language she used to express the complex emotions she could never fully articulate in words. Each brushstroke was an act of reclaiming her identity, a dialogue between past scars and future possibilities. Her canvas held storms and calm seas, darkness and light, pain and beauty, all existing simultaneously, just like her life. This new existence was not free of pain or loss. The shadow of what had been lingered, sometimes long and heavy. But Kate no longer allowed it to define her. Instead, she embraced the paradox of growth, that to move forward, one must carry their history not as a burden, but as a foundation. Her maturity was not in forgetting or forgiving quickly, but in the patient acceptance of complexity, in the willingness to face discomfort without retreating. In the quiet moments before closing, when the last customers had left and the diner hummed softly under the weight of night, Kate often sat by the window, watching the stars emerge one by one. There was peace there, not the kind born of resolution, but of understanding. Life, she realized, was not about perfect endings but ongoing stories, written day by day with courage and grace. And in that truth, Kate found herself, no longer the woman who ran from her past, but the one who carried it with quiet strength, ready to face whatever tomorrow would bring. You said. The ending of Kate's journey did not arrive with fanfare or sudden revelation. It settled quietly, like the gentle closing of a well-read book, a chapter folding softly into the next. Over time, the wounds that once defined her began to transform, not erased, but softened into the subtle contours of wisdom and compassion. The diner, once a symbol of struggle and loss, had become a beacon of hope and renewal, a place where both she and the community could gather strength. The relationships she nurtured, fragile and tentative at first, blossomed into bonds forged through shared hardship and healing. Marty's presence was a constant reminder that second chances were possible, not just for places or dreams, but for people. Kate's heart, once guarded and scarred, opened in unexpected ways. She allowed herself to trust again, to hope again, even love again, but with eyes wide open and lessons learned. She had come to understand that true fulfillment was not about erasing the past or achieving perfection. It was about embracing the entirety of one's experience, including pain, regret, joy, and triumph, and letting all of it coexist. In this acceptance, she found peace, a peace born from the quiet confidence of a soul who had walked through darkness and emerged whole, if not unscarred. The future stretched before her, uncertain yet inviting, no longer a source of fear but a canvas of possibility. The dreams she once thought lost were now seeds planted deep in fertile soil, nurtured by patience and resilience. Kate had grown into a woman who knew that life's meaning was not found in escaping hardship, but in meeting it with courage and grace. As she stood by the diner's window one cool evening, watching the sky shift through hues of fading light, she felt a profound connection to the world around her, a sense of belonging not just to a place, but to the ongoing story of life itself. The smile that touched her lips was quiet but genuine, a reflection of the fulfillment that comes not from endings, but from the brave, tender act of living fully. Her story was no longer one of loss alone, but of redemption, growth, and the quiet joy that comes from finally making peace with oneself. This was her ending, a gentle, enduring beginning wrapped in the warm glow of acceptance and hope.